Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. Unlike the Friday edition, we're dedicating the Tuesday podcast to answering your garden questions. Stay tuned to find out how you can get your garden question into the program. So come on, let's do this.
Hello, Farmer Fred. My name is Joel, and I live in Fremont, California. I have a question about how to test for nitrogen in my soil. Recently, I sent several samples from my garden to a lab, which returned reports indicating low nitrogen. Thanks to you, I am aware that such reports of nitrogen are unreliable, and some other labs don't even report nitrogen. Do you recommend an alternate way to check for nitrogen? Would simply adding compost on a regular basis be sufficient to replenish the nitrogen without testing? Thank you so much for your information. I've learned so much from you through the years.
Joel, thank you for listening to the Garden Basics podcast. Appreciate it. Debbie Flower is here, America's favorite retired college horticultural professor. And Debbie, we have talked in the past about nitrogen and the fact that it's a very important fertilizer ingredient, but it's also very elusive too because it wants to be a gas.
Yes. It wants to be a gas, and it also, if it's in the soil, it moves with water, so it can quickly move out of the root zone.
So how do we solve Joel's issue here? I mean, measuring nitrogen, and I've seen a lot of soil reports, and Joel's right. They don't even talk about nitrogen because nitrogen is hard to measure unless it's really an overabundance of nitrogen. Then the report might mention it. But usually nitrogen is here one day and gone the next.
Right. With students, we used tests the kind where you wet the soil and take the water that's come off the top of the soil and mix it with chemicals to get the color. And then the color tells you how much nitrogen you have. And
those tests can be found at any nursery. They're called NPK tests.
Right. I like, yes. And I like the ones that are a little more sophisticated. I can't think of the brand at the moment.
Lamont.
Yes, I like the Lamont soil test kits. So I use those with students. So you can do that yourself. The instructions are pretty clear. The only thing you probably need is some deionized water, something that you wouldn't necessarily have sitting around your house, and the test kit. But they're not super expensive. They're not super cheap. They tend to have multiple tests per kit, and you can replace the reagents, they're called, the chemicals you need to produce the color. So if you're interested in checking your own nitrogen soil content, that is one way to do it. I did a little bit of research on the type of resin tests you used. They seem to be fairly new, and everything I found was an experiment by an academic institution testing whether they work very well or not. And everybody said they do. They work well. They explained how they work. And as long as the resin capsules are in contact with the soil the correct amount of time. I don't know what the directions were on the tests that you received, but one experiment I read about said if they're there not long enough, they don't tell you how much is actually there. They haven't accumulated it. And if they're there too long, the resin capsules have accumulated a lot of the nutrient, and then they start to give it back to the soil. So the amount they're reading will fluctuate depending on time. And so hopefully that was addressed in the directions you got on that soil test. The way I judge if I have enough nitrogen in my soil is the response of my plants. They will show nitrogen deficiency symptoms if there is not enough there. The classic nitrogen deficiency symptom is yellowing of old growth. So typically that's on the bottom of the plants. And that can occur for a number of reasons, nitrogen being one, but also shade being another. And this is critical. At the same time that those yellow leaves are falling off, you're getting new growth. So the plant is still active, but the leaves at the top that are forming are not getting as big as the other ones. You're getting small new growth. And that's because nitrogen is, as it is in the air and in the water, it is mobile in the plant. When the plant runs out of nitrogen in the soil, it will take it out of the oldest leaves that used to be in the sun but are now in the shade, and it will move it to the new growth. But it's not a super efficient conversion, and so the new growth isn't as big as the old growth that is being sacrificed for it. So that is the classic nitrogen deficiency. A general yellowing of the plant is also a classic nitrogen deficiency. So those are symptoms I look for. On the opposite end, if you apply too much nitrogen, you'll get incredible rapid green growth. You may lack flowers and fruit, and you probably will have an aphid population in your newest growth because the leaves are growing so fast the plant doesn't have enough energy to cover them with a waxy coating quickly enough to prevent the aphids from attacking them. So you can sort of, if you're very observant of your garden, you can sort of adjust, sort of figure out whether your plants have enough nitrogen or not.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, too, especially about the new growth at the top, because most people are looking at the tops of the plants and not the bottom of the plants and may not notice the older yellowing leaves or think that's normal. But that definitely significant smaller leaves at the top. And sometimes they're a little bit distorted, too, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Could be. They just can't grow as well.
Yeah. So that is something to keep your eye on when it comes to a nitrogen deficiency. And as you mentioned, the whole purpose of nitrogen is that green growth. Mm-hmm. Because with green growth, you get leaves. And with leaves, you get photosynthesis. With photosynthesis, you get more plant growth.
Right. More plant food. Yep.
Yeah.
So then the question was, can adding compost provide sufficient nitrogen? Depends what you're growing, I would say. If you're growing something and you're harvesting part of it, food primarily, or you're cutting, it's a cutting garden for flowers, something like that, you're removing enough stuff, enough plant food stuff that you probably can't replace the nitrogen need to continue that harvesting, growing and harvesting just with compost. If you're growing trees and shrubs for nice ambiance in the landscape, then mulch is often sufficient. So it depends what you're growing.
A combination of mulch and compost, I think, is all a garden needs for most crops. But you're right. There are some crops that are heavy feeders, like corn. Mm-hmm. Here's a plant that gets 6 feet tall and uses a lot of nitrogen to get 6 feet tall, with mostly green parts and maybe a couple of ears of corn if you're lucky. You're better off, if you are growing corn in your garden, would be to rotate it through various points in your garden.
Yes.
On a yearly basis.
Yes, there are charts you can read, and I think Fred has posted one, a pie-shaped chart of rotating vegetable crops so that the heavy feeders like corn and cucumbers are maybe preceded by a nitrogen fixer like peas. And that's a way to add nitrogen if you are growing edible things, is to grow a cover crop, it's called, or it's sometimes called green manure, that fixes nitrogen. And that's happens underground on the roots. And you cut off the tops of the plants before they flower, ideally, because a lot of the fixed nitrogen is used to produce the flower. For instance, fava beans are, for us in California, are a nice winter cover crop. But if we let them flower and produce beans, then we're not getting as much of the nitrogen left in the soil. The nitrogen left in the soil is on the roots of the plants, and it becomes available after the plant has died. So you chop off the top of the plant, ideally before it flowers and fruits. You can compost that, chip it and use it as mulch, whatever you prefer. But then the nitrogen underground becomes available. And then, of course, there's always fertilization, and you can fertilize with organic products. Manures have different amounts of nitrogen in them. Chicken manure tends to be one of what we call the hottest, meaning it has the highest amount of nitrogen. Don't use it unless it's been composted. My mother collected some out of her father's chicken coop. That chicken coop hadn't been used for 40 years. Chicken manure had been just sitting there dry. She put it on our vegetable garden and killed everything. Okay, you got to compost it. It's too hot. Too much nitrogen in it. But you can buy composted chicken manure in bags that has some nitrogen value. You can buy pelleted chicken manure in bags that has good nitrogen availability. And of course, it's renewable. There are chickens that are pooping all the time. And you can buy steer manure. It is not nearly as high in nitrogen. You can buy fish emulsion, which is made from fish and has a nice gentle amount of nitrogen, and some micronutrients, which are critical in plant production as well. So there are some more renewable, non-synthetic sources of nitrogen that are good for the producing garden, when you're cutting and removing fruit or flowers or what have you, and need that higher amount of nitrogen.
A cover crop is a great thing to put into your nitrogen replenishment gardening mode, definitely. And like Debbie says, is you got to chop those plants up as soon as you start seeing flowers appear, because you want the energy going to the soil root area where the nitrogen is, as opposed to sending it off to develop flowers and seeds. So by cutting it down in little bitty pieces before it completely flowers, at least before 50% of it flowers, you're going to be helping out your soil a lot. From what I understand, I guess you could just chop it up in little pieces and leave it on the surface, although I've heard of people doing that, but I think that would allow a lot of nitrogen to escape from the top.
Right, you want to bury it. Cover it with mulch, yes. Yeah. Right, nitrogen becomes gaseous, or just dig it down into the soil. Mm-hmm. With a broad fork might allow you to do that, because it can create... Broad fork is like a big garden fork, a garden fork being the stiff one with, 4 or 5 tines?
4, yeah, usually. Yeah.
But a broad fork can be 3 feet long, 4 feet long, however wide your bed is, and it has many tines, and you just plunge it into the soil, rock it back and forth. You get a little opening. You can throw stuff in there, and then you move over a few inches and do it again. That closes the opening you just made and makes another one where you can put in more.
A little bit goes a long way, too.
Yes.
That's my big problem with synthetic fertilizers, is there's usually way too much nitrogen that the plant will never get to.
And it becomes pollution.
Exactly, yeah. And there are a much more slow release nitrogen fertilizers on the market these days. I know out at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center, they like to use this chicken poop based pellets.
Right. And I bought a bag of that. It's not
Nutri-Rich, I believe it's called.
Yes, right. Costs a pretty penny, but it goes a long, long way.
What is the application rate?
I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I could look it up.
Well, maybe, if it's there.
Nutri-Rich fertilizer pellets. Use 500 to 800 pounds per acre.
All right. Well, now you have a 8x4 garden.
It says 8 to 12 pounds per 100 square feet. Yeah, it's not a very heavy application rate.
8 to 12 pounds per 100 square feet.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's not bad.
So I have about a third of that.
Yeah, and you work it in. You don't just lay it on the top.
I work it in shallowly, and then I rely on water to move it down.
Okay. Yeah. Fish emulsion, an old standby for a low nitrogen fertilizer that works because it slowly breaks down. A lot of people like worm castings, too. I would put that into your mix for replenishing the soil as well. And you're right, that broad fork does a great job of opening cracks in the soil to allow you to just pour the worm castings into there.
Yeah. You don't have to go real deep because nitrogen moves with water. Water's applied at the top and it goes down through the soil. So it'll pick up the nitrogen near the surface and carry it down through the soil.
Yeah. A word about mulch. A lot of people like to use bark. They call up the sand and gravel place and have 10 yards of chips delivered, for example. And all those chips are the same size. And a lot of them are big. And it takes a long time for those to break down to feed the soil. Mm-hmm. Whereas your local tree company, when they go out and chop down a tree, they're not just chopping the tree, they're chipping it and shredding it and blowing it into the back of their truck. And there's no reason that truck can't stop at your place and dump it off in your driveway. And it's all different sizes. And as the smaller parts work their way in the soil, it's feeding the soil, but the bigger parts are still on top. And they're protecting the little stuff and protecting your soil from rain as well.
Yeah. It's good stuff. I have very black, rich soil. It's gotten to the point because I apply arborist chippings regularly. Not yearly, every 2 or 3 years, I'd say. But I always have a pile in my yard because I'm always doing another corner. Yeah. It's gotten to the point where I can't grow some plants that like lean soil because I have my soil.
You've spoiled the little...
Yes.
So-and-so. I would like to make an argument for using shredded leaves. The leaves that fall from your trees in the fall, especially your oak leaves. And I like to run them over with a mulching mower or stick them in a metal trash can and chop them up with a string trimmer and then just pour it on top of my raised beds, 4 inches, 6 inches deep for the entire fall and winter.
And I think that's a better choice for the vegetable garden than wood. There's evidence that when we mulch with wood, which the arborist chips are, the biology in the soil favors plants that are woody. When we mulch with leaves, which are herbaceous, although fall leaves fall into the woody sort of category, the high carbon category.
Is it green or is it brown?
Right.
I've had that argument for years.
Right. The biology in the soil tends to favor plants that are herbaceous, which most of our vegetable crops are.
And ideally, if you have a healthy garden, would be to get yourself a little chipper shredder and shred up those plant parts too and use that as a mulch.
I just got one for Christmas.
Did you?
Yes, an electric one. Oh. And I used it at my son had one and I used it at his house and it was so easy and it produced nice little chips. And
did you try using green material in it?
I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't. And I'll have to do that when I go home and it stops raining. Yeah. So I asked for one for Christmas. My son lives in Minnesota. So I can't borrow it, but I asked for one for Christmas, and I got it.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm all excited.
Yeah, that's really, everybody should have a chipper shredder.
Yes.
Yes, because we all have green waste.
Yes.
And there's no reason that green waste, and the healthiest green waste you can apply as long as your plants are healthy is the ones that you have in your own yard as opposed to some stranger's compost from whatever.
Yes.
Or mulch from wherever.
That is, the arborist chips sometimes bring you surprise plants.
Yeah, especially if they chop down a liquid amber tree. Yeah. All right. So there's that. So, Joel, a good question about nitrogen, and there are plenty of ways to keep it replenished, but you just have to keep at it.
And so interesting to hear your curiosity. I love it.
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was thanking Joel. Want to leave us a garden question? You'll find a link at gardenbasics.net. Also, when you click on any episode at gardenbasics.net, you're going to find a link to SpeakPipe. You'll find it in the show notes. And when you bring up SpeakPipe on your computer or smartphone, you can leave us an audio question without making a phone call. Or you can go to SpeakPipe directly. That's speakpipe.com/gardenbasics. You want to call or text us? We have that number posted at gardenbasics.net. It's 916-292-8964, 916-292-8964. Email? Sure, we like email. Send it along with your pictures to fred@farmerfred.com. Or again, go to gardenbasics.net and get that link. And if you send us a question, be sure to tell us where you're gardening, because all gardening is local. Find it all at gardenbasics.net. Here's a question that comes in from Felicia. She's a little confused about what new soil to put in her new raised bed. Felicia says, "Happy spring, Farmer Fred. I am purchasing 5 raised beds from a local company, and I need them filled with the best soil around. I know how important good soil is for vegetable gardening. I've asked on the local Facebook gardening group, but nobody told me exactly what type of soil to get. They just told me where to get it. And everywhere I've checked, I've seen all different kinds of soil, and I'm unsure what I should purchase. Can you help me, please?" Well, a happy spring to you too, Felicia. And that's a tough question to answer, but here are a few guidelines. You are quite correct that good soil for a vegetable garden is important for successful raised bed gardening. The definition of good, however, might depend upon whom you ask. And let me say right off the bat, anytime you create a raised bed with commercial soil, you are merely starting the process of developing good soil. The process takes years to improve that soil so that it has the microbiology and structure to feed more microbiology. It's not an overnight process. You have to feed that soil year after year with what it needs. Now, you don't say where you live, so this will be some general guidelines for acquiring a soil mix for raised beds. First of all, try to avoid using garden soil from someone else's property, because who knows what weed seeds and diseases it carries. Even your own garden soil is risky because of weed seeds and possibly its composition. Obviously, you don't want a clay-based, rock-filled raised bed. You have to determine how much of a soil mix you need, too, for the raised beds. One handy mathematical formula to remember is that 27 cubic feet make a cubic yard. So you want to multiply the width, length, and depth of your raised bed in feet, and that'll give you the cubic feet necessary for that raised bed. I would subtract 4 inches from the height because you're going to be amending that soil mix immediately with material that I'll bring up in a minute here. The finished product should be a soil level in the raised bed frame about an inch or two lower than the sides of the frame. Plus, that lower level will help you avoid runoff of water down the sides. And that gap will be very important to allow you to install some screening on the top of the bed to keep kitty cats out. I like to use 6-inch mesh hardware cloth, also known as hardware screens, for that purpose. If your raised beds are, say, 4 feet wide or less, then it's no problem laying those 4 feet by 5 feet sheets, or that size cut from a roll of the wire, on the top of the beds. Cats don't like tippy-toeing across those 6-inch mesh openings. Plus, that space on the screen allows you to more easily determine the spacing when you're planting. Also, you have to consider how you're going to irrigate that raised bed. If it's by soaker hose or an inline drip emitter system, the footprint of that water from those emitters or soaker hose will only be about 7 or 8 inches in diameter in that new commercial soil mix. In other words, it's like a cylinder of water that penetrates the soil, and it's going to be rather narrow in your first few years of existence. So you might want to space the lateral lines of that system about 8 inches apart. If you're going to use micro sprayers, make sure the overlap of the spray from one head is about 50% of the adjacent sprayer's throw. You're going to have to water that newly filled raised bed more often in its first few years of operation because it's going to rapidly drain out. 2 other important considerations for that raised bed before you add that soil mix. You want to incorporate a few inches of the new potting or raised bed mix with the existing soil that's underneath the raised bed, your existing ground, because this will improve drainage. And if gophers are a problem in your area, laying down a 1/2-inch mesh hardware cloth along the bottom of the bed and running it up the sides of the bed about halfway can help keep the gophers out. So you would do that after tilling in that new soil with the existing soil. No matter what soil mix you choose, you need to improve it every growing season with the addition of compost. Do you choose a green-derived compost or a woody-derived compost? And you want to add worm castings as well. This will improve what they call the tilth of the soil. It improves its water-holding capacity as well as feeding the microbiology in the soil, which in turn feeds the roots of your plants. And then topping the soil with a few inches of an organic mulch, about 2 to 4 inches year-round, goes a long way towards making that new raised bed a winner. That mulch layer does a lot of good. It moderates soil temperature, it helps to maintain even soil moisture, it controls the number of weeds that might pop up, it breaks up the force of the rain that can pummel a garden bed, and that can compact the soil. And as the mulch breaks down, it feeds the soil and its microbiology. The mulch can be from any number of sources, including your own compost pile. You can use chipped and shredded tree branches and leaves, shredded leaves from mostly healthy trees. Walnut leaves, though, are not recommended because of its allelopathic nature. Gather the leaves in fall, chop them up with a mulching mower or a string trimmer in a metal trash can. Now, what about commercial mulch? Well, only if it has variable sizes, and that's the beauty of using chipped and shredded branches and leaves. The smaller stuff breaks down first, while the larger parts serve as the protective top mulch layer. And don't pile that mulch right next to the stems of your plant. Give them a demilitarized zone of a mulch-free area for about an inch or two to avoid rot issues. Now, I realize at this point you have still not received an answer from me to your question, how do I start this car? Because my answer so far has been the question, how does an engine work? All right, if your final soil total need is basically several cubic yards, you might save money by getting those cubic yards from a commercial sand and gravel yard. However, there's something to be said for the safety of buying sterilized bag materials. That means you're not inviting any stray diseases into your raised beds, especially verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, or nematodes. After all, who knows where that sand and gravel company got their ingredients for their soil mix? Another consideration, after you have filled your raised bed, you want to do a pH test of the soil. Follow the instructions on the label. Make sure the pH of the soil matches the crops you're trying to grow. Most garden vegetables like a pH between 6 and 7.5. Maybe you're planting blueberries, though. Well, they need a more acidic pH around 5.5. If your pH results show a soil outside that range, follow the instructions usually included with the pH test kit on what to use to modify the pH to get to the desired number. And remember, it could take months for that change to take effect. As a result, whatever you're growing in that first year just might look a little sad. Now, having said all that, if you're choosing a bagged potting mix or a raised bed mix, I would suggest that you shop local. Try to find products that are produced nearby. If you're choosing your soil from a sand and gravel company, your best bet is to choose the ones that are intended for a home garden raised bed. You don't want heavy soil, you don't want clay, but maybe a mix of lighter components such as a mix or blend of peat moss, coir, compost, a little mushroom compost, worm castings, sand, a silt loam component, or forest byproducts. But again, you're taking a risk because usually their silt loam component is what they might refer to as river bottom soil, which contains who knows what it contains. Remember, too, that the pile you're looking at in the sand and gravel yard may not be the pile that gets delivered to you unless it's that same day. If that sand and gravel mix is the choice you make, definitely do that pH test of the soil and incorporate generous amounts of bag compost and worm castings into the top of the soil. A tough thing to answer, though, with a lot of bagged compost is, what is the source of their ingredients? For a garden where you are growing annual crops, you might be better off using a green waste-based compost, not a bagged product that says as the main ingredient forest byproducts. If, though, you're going to be growing fruit trees or woody food-producing shrubs or vines, you do want that woody-based compost that contains forest byproducts. Different composts build up different soil biologies, depending upon whether it's a typical garden vegetable where there's no hardwood involved, or a shrub or a tree. If you want to read more on this topic, author Jeff Lowenfels has a series of books that begin with the words teeming with, such as teeming with microbes, teeming with fungi, teeming with bacteria, and a lot more. That can really get you into a deep dive of studying the microbiology of soil and what works best to grow the crops you want. Now, having said all that, Debbie Flower's research indicates, as far as compost goes, that sourcing it is not that critical. It's more critical when you're considering which mulch to use. Now, as a final move, I might take soil samples of the raised bed mix and send them off to a soil testing service so you can see what your new raised beds are lacking in the way of nutrients. 3 reasonably priced sources for soil testing include the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Texas A&M, and Colorado State University. We'll have links to all 3 of those in today's show notes. All right, thank you, Felicia, for bearing with me on this answer. Raised bed gardening is near and dear to my heart, and if it's one thing I've learned, it takes time to build up great garden soil. Garden Basics with Farmer Fred comes out every Tuesday and Friday, and it's brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Garden Basics, it's available wherever podcasts are handed out. For more information about the podcast, visit our website, gardenbasics.net, and that's where you can find out about the free Garden Basics newsletter, Beyond the Basics. And thank you so much for listening.